What does it mean for you to be a Russian artist these days? Or like, how did it change?
My initial answer would be that I don't really think in these categories. I think like maybe some part of it also like comes to like a fact like, okay, at which point in my life I started to identify myself as an artist. And then probably that wasn't so much more prevalent in Russia because back then I was more in curation and I was more into humanities and those kind of things. But at the same time, of course, I was like involved in art and at some point in artistic scene as well. But at the same time, also I don't feel that I think like here as an immigrant, I don't think a lot of the fact that I'm actually Russian, or like especially in my artistic practice, I try not to kind of put myself into that box because a lot of my work speaks more about common human condition and not necessarily my Russianness. Of course, if we would talk about it, then there's probably a lot of Russian points to it, but it's also so hard to define like, okay, what in me is Russian and what is not. So like it's such a complex phenomenon in contemporary world where like also people travel a lot. You're in one international environment and in another international environment. Then you also collide with the nationalities that is like in the country you're living in, which is German for now. But it's also like, I think a lot about the fact that it's something that you understand in relation. Like, you know, I understand that I'm Russian. I understand that I'm a Russian artist in relation like to you being a Polish artist or like a Polish dancer, right? So like before we collide in these nationalities, like before we know about it, I don't think about the fact that we are somewhat different in this sense. So like it's a broader question for me and how it changed. Like I do remember when the war started. So like there is a contemporary political scientist, Ekaterina Sliman, who was talking and still is talking a lot about the contemporary conflict. And she's like one of the oppositional cohort in Russia. So her thinking and her like work is like crucially important for understanding what's happening now and like also like for just the majority of Russians. And like I can argue probably a lot with her also narratives and how maybe like not narratives but just general ideas. Of course there is still should be a lot of critique to opposition always. It's very important from my point of view, but at the same time I do remember once like it was like the early month of the war. And first of all, like at that point, like I was still in Russia and like I did thought, like we all thought in that moment that it's not going to be such a long conflict, like it's not going to be such a long war. And we all were like quite surprised and affected, of course, by everything. And like surprise is a bad word, you know, like it's really hard to describe what happened. But like, of course, your change of the world just changes a lot. And like your perception of like what is life and what is your life, what is life in this country and outside of it, it's just like changes a lot. And then I do remember that this person, like this political scientist, she was in one of her interviews, she mentioned that it's really important to remind yourself that the war that is happening now, and like despite the fact how you might feel affected in your own life, like it will affect your life, it will change your life in many different ways, but it's not necessary, like you are not the victim. And like it's really important to take yourself out of there, you know, like to accept the change, but in a way that it's necessary. So it's still necessarily, from my point, to react and to do something, which I try to do, like by choosing like leaving the country, not paying like taxes, etc., like leaving my job there and continuing life elsewhere. It's also like not that this decision is better than any other decision. It's more like a choice. Like what do you think you can do in your life to make, like, I don't know, it's not maybe to make a difference, to make something out of it. Like not something out of it, but more like to try to affect the situation, even this with this small individualistic kind of move. And I know, of course, if we're going back to the direct question, how my life changed as an artist and like being Russian, I wouldn't say actually that here in Germany I'm pretty much I'm not confronted with it at all. But I know this can happen, of course, and I don't really, like, you know, I don't really like to talk. Like, it's usually a first question, especially if you like speak English in Germany. Of course, people ask you a lot where you come from, but it's also like now it's something that I try to avoid, and also try to avoid from both sides, not asking immigrants from where they come from, to like try to connect without this difference in us, you know, like trying to just talk to a person as if it would be a person without any connotation that you can assign. Because of course people can assign connotation towards your nationality, and then like you always feel that you need to say something, or you need to, like, as an artist, maybe you need to work with the political concern of contemporality. But then for me, like, the political concern would be broader, and I would like, I did one project related to political imprisonment in Russia. Still haven't released it yet. It was exhibited in Bremen, but I didn't release it publicly, which I think I will do, but a bit in the future. But I actually, like, it's still, you know, like, for me, it's a project, yes, directly about the case of political imprisonment in Russia, but it's also, like, showing that political imprisonment is the worldwide problems, and there is a lot of political imprisonment in Germany as well. And then it's like one thing leads to another, and nothing in this world exists by itself. And that's also a very important thing that you learn when you leave your own country. You understand that a lot of things are kind of like come not to nationality, but to human condition per se. Yeah, this is like, for me, it's more important to kind of like attest that, yes, there is difference, and I can explain a lot of, like, you know, political concepts and problematics in contemporary Russia. Like, if people would ask me, but it's also like, do I necessarily want to go into that conversation directly with the person? So sometimes I try to not be very concentrated on my Russianness or whatever. And then, of course, later on, you know, like, I know that at some point I will face probably some sort of quote-unquote discrimination in a way of mine, because this happens to people, and I also, like, I know what can happen. But that's like, that's a normal part of life, unfortunately. It's not that one should necessarily fight it. I would rather like to address the common problem of it, like, why we necessarily play this binary opposition, you know, like good and evil, and then, like, because at the end of the day, a lot of times we are individual artists and not like representatives of our nationalities, I would say. Some people tend to be, right, to represent their, I wouldn't say culture, but yeah, nationality in the broader context that also can be a career path, and that's normal. I don't think that applies to me. And I feel like a lot of people told me this, and not only Russians, but like you also change in immigration, and you evolve and you grow. And then, like, you don't want to be the one who answers all the question of your nationality, because you're as individual, or like, yeah, you're usually more than that, or like it's more complex than that. And then, of course, there's different level. There is more of like bureaucratic level, for example, that of course a lot of times I will face more problems maybe than European artists in some ways, because I'm carrying non-European passport. So like this, all things, they're pretty much there. Probably that's why, you know, a lot of Russians don't want to speak on this kind of topics, just because like it would be so easy to disregard a lot of my words and thinking as like, I don't know, avoiding responsibility or whatever, but it's like, it's not necessarily that, a very huge and big topics. And sometimes, of course, like, and I think a lot of people would agree that you anticipate that people would have a certain reaction if they know that you're Russian, but then, because then you kind of like, oh, should I like position myself like somewhere, like, should I be like, there is a term like a good Russian, and people sometimes say, oh, you're a good type of Russian, and then I'm like, I don't know, like, I know what they mean, but at the same time it's like, you know what I mean, you know, like it's a bit uncomfortable. But it's also like, you're not in the position, and I'm not in the position here, like you are general in the position to argue the circumstances right now, because there are more and bigger problems and bigger suffering that is happening. So it's like, yeah, I guess you have to think about it, but keep it to yourself, you know. And then also I just try not to perpetuate the good Russian narrative or whatever. Just like, if people say it to me, I'm just taking it but not arguing, because then it's like, it's there and let it be there for now, but then we think or see what it can happen with this term. Because yeah, that's also like, I feel that a lot of times people also encounter more privileged Russians. So like, Russia is a huge country. Despite the fact how Soviet Union tried to make everything homogeneous, it's still like very diverse. And this diversity has been erased for a century. So like when you meet a Russian, you meet completely different people a lot of time. But the problem is that a lot of times, probably in Europe, we meet more privileged type of Russians, and then there is a certain stereotype that is being created upon that image. Also, like, that's an important part to understand, that people meet those privileged groups of people who are able to leave Russia, and that's a privilege in itself. And like everything piles up on top of that. But like, it's a very important notion that the majority of Russians, they cannot travel because they don't have resources, cannot leave the country, and that's like important. This way, I would, say that I'm probably much more confronted by my age or accepted gender in art than I am confronted by my nationality. And for that, I'm kind of like, for now it's like this, maybe it will change, but I'm glad that it's like this. And I hope that, of course, a lot of things, like I'm still a white person, it also makes it easier in a way. So I don't face in Germany that much discrimination or any discrimination. Because like, at the end of the day, a lot of people would not question even my nationality, That's a lucky kind of thing, I would say.
Did your perception of nationality or your responsibility change since the war started?
I feel like I never have been truly connected to the fact I'm like Russian. I feel like at some point in my life I became pretty much bilingual, and I don't remember when it happened. So I'm not raised bilingual, but at some point in my life I started thinking in English as well. Now I don't have this border, we're speaking about borders between languages, so like it's a very smooth transition. And now I have like a third language a little bit, so, and it's all kind of like blends together. It still has expanded my view, and like, with the rise of the internet era, it all have expanded a lot of things in my thinking, even back then in my small hometown, like rather small hometown. And so maybe it's important to explain that I come from the Karelian region, and it's a region that is divided between Russia and Finland, and it's very close to the Finnish border. And that's actually a very funny moment, because like usually when you say that you're like from the cold part of Russia, people assume, of course, which is like an indicator for me that we are all very much ignorant to our geography, like I'm not offended by that, but I just take it as a fact and as an interesting thought that, like people think, okay, if I'm like from the cold part of Russia, then probably I'm from Siberia. And Siberia is like fucking far of my hometown, like I never been there. I have no, like I knew people from there, and I know how different it is, but it's also like important thing, like, and like this region, it carries like its own kind of like ethnicity. So there is Karelians, which is close to it's like a Finnish group, I think you can assign it to the Finnish ethnicity. So it's like, it could be potentially a different country, or like in some way it could be a part of Finland. So all of those things, they're very much blended in Russia. And then like a lot of my family, part of my family is Ukrainian. So like they were settled in their cold, dark place, which was also a little bit bizarre, but that's what Soviet Union did. And it's an important part to understand. So that's why, you're raised by partly displaced people. And this displacement is very different from the displacement that we have, because we can, like, I think a lot about it. Like, we can Google a place where we go. Like, I'm like, oh, okay, Bremen, can walk, like, Google Maps or whatever, and I can imagine my life here. I can know a place before I'm going there. And when my grandpa was moved from his village in West Ukraine, at 17, so like his father just had a thought, or like not a thought, but like he knew from someone that there is a college, and a college in Russia is something as Ausbildung here. So he knew that there is a college that trains people to work for a train station. And my grandfather, he wasn't like very good at school, so he needed like, somewhere we can be accepted easily, and that was the place. So they just took a train, and he brought him there. And my grandfather didn't speak Russian. And of course, yes, Russian and Ukrainian is like a Slavic group of languages, but it's a completely different language. I don't understand Ukrainian. And like, can you imagine? As if we been brought in Germany like with the closed eyes, and we don't speak German, and like, we don't have like a cell phone to check some words or like to understand. No, we don't know some other language we can talk. And then we have to study. So it's like an important part of like those kind of displacements that it's kind of like was completely forced and so foreign. And I think like my grandfather, his whole life, like the majority of his life happened in Russia, but he still is pretty much like, I feel that he lived his life as a displaced person. I feel like when you are raised by the that it passes on in generations in a way. So I feel like somehow I never was truly thinking about like, oh yes, I'm Russian. Like at first, when I started first living in Europe bits by bits, like exchange programs or something, of course, I was more identifying as a Russian for people. Like it's like it came in comparison, right? I think now, of course, I have to think much more about the fact that I'm Russian, because then it can, I have this always like basic setting in my head that I have to be careful in a way how I speak. So like there is this always censorship within myself, but I don't probably like it's not a bad thing, you know, it's a conscious kind of thing, but it comes with a lot of different complications that I cannot truly understand always. I cannot be sorry forever for that fact, so I try to like not to be sorry for that, because that's my experience. It's more like, what would I do with it, you know? Would I try to, because a lot of times I sometimes have a thought like maybe it was better to stay there and try to change things, you know, and then, but life is long and we never know what's gonna happen and how you can. I certainly believe that human being in there, like we're all good in something and we should try to be good in that something, despite the fact what other people like say and do. And like, you know, there is like a lot of radicalization in contemporary resistance, and that we all should be very radical. But I feel like if, for example, protesting is not your thing and you can better write about problem, then that writing can actually help. And there would be like a huge debate about whether this writing help, and it's not like this academic enclosed kind of sort of knowledge, but then some people reach that knowledge and it can influence someone's mind, and like that's already important. And yeah, that's what I feel like. We all have to try to be good in our own small thing.
But from the moment that you decided to leave Russia, did you experience any borders?
Of course, I experienced like borders and that was like probably my first problem when I realized like what it is to carry Russian passport, you know, like, but it happened before war. I think and that's actually my thought. I have a belief that COVID and the practice that European Union and like those, and like of course before, and the sanctions, and like from the first war like in 2014, of course there were a lot of consequences, but then I feel the COVID was a pivotal kind of point where Russia became very isolated and we couldn't travel because the borders were closed. And I feel that was like a very good repetition for the contemporary Russian president, whose name I don't want to pronounce, but I feel that was a good repetition for him to kind of realize that he's in a way ready to be enclosed in a country. So traveling, I feel it was post-Soviet kind of thing maybe, but I think like this idea of an iron curtain was like sitting all along in my head since I've learned about it as a child. And I was like, how can you not leave the country? How can you leave somewhere without a permission being left? That felt so claustrophobic for me, even though, you know, Russia is huge. But traveling was also always a part to represent social status in a way. And I come from not a very privileged background. And then I feel like I always had this idea that I need to travel a lot when I grew up in a way. And then COVID was there like when I was quite young, so I was like 20 or something, finishing my bachelor, so I didn't know shit about the world. Like I didn't have much money or whatever. And like that was the first point when I was like, oh, okay, now I cannot in a way. Like I traveled a little bit and then like I was closed again. And then there is like this almost childhood, you know, years that you can't leave. And this is like this very claustrophobic that you can't do. And I do remember during war already, I received the visa. And I feel like that's the period when I feel the most guilty of, because like the first half a year I was also like in a relationship and my partner didn't want to leave. And I kind of like put aside a lot of my political beliefs because of the personal narrative I had back then. But I was also younger, and well, you're young, those things happen. It's like you don't know how to react. You grow out, like you don't have like completely any kind of tools to solve this situation, so to think even about them. So everything was, you needed to learn something, I guess. And then, I guess the first half a year was I even managed to have like a really, not a bad summer. And then I think of it and I was like, how did it is even possible, like, but it was all in we were saying goodbyes to our friends. So everything started crumbling, of course. But this crumbling was like so gradual and so kind of like in a way a bit invisible. And then until the moment that you actually understand that everything's crumbling. And then on the day of my birthday, like 21st September, 2022, I think there was like the mobilization declared for the Russian men to go to military. Then things got more like, kind of like people I was working with left the country. People started fleeing like much rapidly. Like my partner fled. I was like left alone suddenly, But before that, shortly, I applied for the visa to Finland. And I got like half a year, and that was the first and the last time before I finally moved to Europe when I got a visa. Because like it's becoming like having now a visa as a Russian is a very privileged, harder and harder to get it, which is fair. But at the same time, it's an individual responsibility in a world where it's actually not the individual responsibility. But it's a huge narrative. So, it's not a huge narrative, but huge problematics upon which like everyone can argue. So like if in comparison to the war that it's actually happening, Russians not getting visa is not like the worst point, right? But like when we think about also like the people who want to live their lives, and I don't mean quotations, I mean like visiting your relatives or like et cetera. But that's how it works for now. It's like, I guess very distorted, and you can see at it from the very different perspective. I guess back then I started to like, you start to encounter like these borders and this. So they kind of like start with this passport situation, and then I started to travel more by land because like now you can't travel much by plane. So like you need to know now how to travel to Russia, and a lot of times it is by land. And back then I first traveled by land to Finland, and since then there were like a lot of land borders, I guess, like between Georgia, Caucasus region of Russia. That one I crossed several times. Then it was one Estonian and Russian border, and recently it was Polish and Russian border between Kaliningrad and Gdansk, but not Gdansk. There is and you really start to compare a lot of things there. It's like it becomes. I really like the process of crossing borders by, like, this traveling which is absolutely inefficient. You spend a lot of lives, but you also encounter so many lives, and you encounter so many circumstances, and like also like talking with border guards, and also like seeing how many. So the premise of the border is pretty much the same. In contemporary world, it is treated as the like definition or like defense or everything that is like very closely tied to the military side of society, or like the political ground of the society. But then you actually encounter a lot of life in there, and also bureaucracy, and everything is entangled. So I'm like very responsive to those. When I'm in those situations, I'm like trying to observe as much as I can, because like it's incredibly interesting to see all those people, and also like people fighting in lines, or like bragging which passports they have. Like you encounter a lot of not nice things there, like just also which come to human conditions. And then like you just observe and see, because like a lot of times I'm in my bubble, and I have my bubble, and it's comfortable because people understand me there. But like when you encounter like the real life, if there is something not real about this life, but there's one particular interesting story that I can tell about the borders and like the encounters of this, like the actual encounter of the border, because we used to travel with my friends around Georgia and like mountains and those kind of things, and once I don't remember which was our destination, but we couldn't go there exactly because, so when you're in the Caucasus and you travel, so in nature, right, you're by car, and our driver was like, okay, we cannot go this way because there is the Azerbaijani border, and I cannot go there. And we were like, okay, then maybe we can go to other place. And we went to David Kareji Monastery. And this is a monastery complex that was like built in early centuries. I will not say in which one because I don't necessarily remember, but it's like a very old thing. It's like in the mountains, a complex of several buildings. And it was the second time we were there, but it's quite beautiful and also like all surrounded by mountain, badlands or like Caucasus. Incredible feeling. But then we were just walking there, and like this is a territory that's also like somewhat divided between Azerbaijan and Georgia. That it's like a point of also negotiation because like it's hard to define to which country this like belongs. And of course, like in the Caucasus, if you know a little bit, there is a huge always fights around borders and territories because everything is very confined, but like there are a lot of countries situated in that area. And then basically there was a border guard sitting on the rock. So it's just like a mountain, you know, like nothing is there. There is a monastery, a rock, and this guard. And we're trying, and then my friend was like, oh, like last time we were there, like the guy said that he would let us like a little bit higher. Like maybe we can do it. And the guy was just like sitting there and smoking. And we were like we were just like silent, trying to go to like hike up the hill, up the rock kind of. And the person was like, no, you can't go there. It's Azerbaijani territory. You can't go there. And we were like, are you sure? And he was like, yeah, I'm sure you can't go there. Sorry. And then he was like, but yeah, but the guy last time said that he was like, so no, like it's a border. And like, and you know, like you're just like, what the fuck? Like we are in the middle of nowhere, you know, like it's just like there is a rock, there is this monastery, and like one guy that is just smoking on the rock, nothing is there. And somehow this is a border. And you cannot, like, you know, and this is the way because like when you travel through the land border, they would create some certain like set of conditions, like, you know, there would be fences or like one schlagbaum and another one and like those things, like, and a lot of people in the military. Then you would see like, okay, there are like, you have to show your passport. And there you just like, oh no, we can't go there by car because that is already Azerbaijani territory. And you would think there. Like how? And I know that it happens a lot to people that sometimes they, you know, like ride, especially like if they're not locals, sometimes they just like grab a car and drive and they sometimes can find themselves in Azerbaijani territory and then they have problems because they weren't allowed to enter there like that. And then like, of course, your perception of this notion of a border changes because like that's so different from country to country. And like, depending on which passport you hold, it would also, I feel, very much like affect your understanding of the border because like for some people, like for Indians for example, it's so hard, like they need visas like almost everywhere, and that also like conditions a lot of thinking about how you can navigate yourself in this world. That's like there is this contemporary philosopher in the forest, Edouard Glissant, if you've heard of him, and he writes a lot about, he was like in the same school as Frantz Fanon actually, so they both in a way practice a political theory, but Glissant talks more about creolization and like globalization and those kind of things, and he has this kind of concept about one world in relation, and I actually like to read him a lot just because he has so much compassion for the contemporary human condition, and that is in my way like wonderful because a lot of times you read decolonial literature and it can be very harsh, which is like, okay, I understand that it's very urgent question and like we have to be urgent in a way and we have to be quote unquote radical, but at the same time I feel like sometimes it lacks compassion and like understanding that exactly like it's not that we have to necessarily pose all the, I don't like the word culture, but I don't think there is better word for now because like for some, like I feel like it's a bit like historicism and we don't know really what we assign to culture and what we don't anymore. So like for example, is language a culture or not? So I feel like it's more deep than that. And I also don't think that it's about like national identity per se. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that, you know, you have to pose all the time, or at least like if you're posing, you have to understand that not everyone should be agreeing on your set of, you know, things, on your set of conditions or perceptions. but also like there is a very something gentle and compassion and relation that we can like, you know, understand this world better if we listen better. And if we are not necessarily have to, you know, blend cultures together by erasing them, you know, there are more ways to that. There are more, and that comes to borders as well. And he talks about borders in a way that, you know, that it shouldn't be anymore something built for defense, you know, like it should be something that, like borders can be beautiful, but not in the sense I feel that we have them now where it is like completely protective source. And of course, like my perceptions of borders changed greatly. And of course, like as a Russian, you always think about like, you know, what the hell, why is this one country? And those kind of things. Or like when suddenly your government decides that this part of the world will become like your country. And then you're just thinking about the people who live in those places. You're just like, how can they, you know, how can one day you are in one country and the next day you're in another country? That's insane. It's not what it should be about, unfortunately. But somehow the masculine part of this thinking, like, you know, just taking and owning, just still prevailing in the narrative somehow.
And do you think that with the access to information and internet, the borders become stronger for you, or they blur?
I think internet blurs a lot of things, maybe, but it's also like, you know, media is so untrustworthy, and we all know that. And then there's like, when you also know, when you start speaking several languages, I guess, you change from one source to another source, and then you just realize that it's information. And in information, there is like truth sides to it and non-truthful sides to it. Sometimes it becomes more of a weapon of control, and weapon of like exactly creating different sides of borders that are much more dangerous, that, you know, like borders in thinking. So like, because then like, you know, what you choose to read also position you somewhere. So like, do you choose to read like Russian liberal news, or like you choose to read Bremen news, or you choose to read common German news, or like New York Times, or like, you know, those kind of things. And then all of that is pretty much different. Or like European news in general. And then some of them tries better to be neutral, but I don't feel that journalism right now is neutral. It's completely not. It's very like mobilizing, and like sometimes I don't really know where it mobilizes us. Yeah. Like I feel it creates just so much more differentiation in people, which is initially not there if you just try to go outside on the street and communicate with the environment. Not environment, but like society. And like with Russians is inherently, Russians, they don't trust people, you know. And I feel like that's probably something that comes from like Soviet Union, where like the other is always the possibility for you to be ratted out. So like in the socialist Soviet system, people were the ones who kind of like protected, but at the same they didn't, because like your neighbor is someone who can potentially know what you are doing wrong, and they can rat you out. And therefore you try to keep as much as things to yourself and like in the individual realm. And of course, like we have been raised by those kind of people that are not just trustworthy of the society. So there is no belief in the society, and like when there is no belief in the society, you cannot like move forward. That's an important part. Like yes, we haven't agreed on like being there, you know. Like I haven't agreed on being Russian. Nobody asked me, you know, like those kind of things. You haven't agreed on being Polish, but at the same time, this is a reality, and we still have to make something out of it. And I sometimes feel that, you know, the contemporary discourse would rather argue about non-humanistic, non-human-centered perspective, and I'm like, yeah, great, I like this discourse, it's amazing, but like what about like as of here today, humans still have so many problems that we have like between each other, and then we try to kind of like speak about something that is beyond human, which is great thing to do, but at the same time we're still here and we don't have any other perception except for human perception. That's the reality of things. I don't know. And borders are created in the same manner by humans, you know, by our own kind of like protective mechanisms.